In our first reading today, the prophet Isaiah says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." Now, of course, Jesus knows all about the prophet Isaiah. Many of the prophecies regarding Jesus are found in the book of the prophet Isaiah. Jesus is intimately familiar with the writings of the prophet Isaiah. So why, if he knows about the prophet Isaiah, and since he's God, he knows all things, he knows about this passage from our first reading today, where Isaiah says that God's house will be a house of prayer for all people. Why, if Jesus knows this, why would he talk to this Canaanite woman in such a fashion? Because he doesn't talk to her like she's someone that he's bringing to his holy mountain, someone that he's going to make joyful in his house of prayer. He talks to her like she's an old, no-good Canaanite. A Canaanite who he couldn't be bothered to even acknowledge when she first came up to him. She called out, "Have pity on me, Lord, Son of David." You see, she knew about the prophet Isaiah. She knew that he was the Lord, a descendant of David, that he was the Messiah. She knew that he was fulfilling the prophecies from the book of Isaiah. And yet, she's still just a Canaanite. And it made perfect sense to the disciples. Of course, you don't talk to Canaanites. You don't drink the same water. You don't eat the same food. You don't stay in the same inns. You don't associate with Canaanites at all. Now the disciples say, "Send her away, for she keeps calling out after us." You know, it's annoying, Jesus. You know how these Canaanites are, always wanting something. Jesus acknowledges this idea of separation and segregation, this idea of keeping the undesirables apart. Because he answers them, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That makes perfect sense to the disciples. You see, the disciples, they're not biblical scholars. The disciples are fishermen. They probably don't know that God said through the prophet Isaiah that his house would be a house of prayer for all people. They may have never heard this passage before, but I guarantee that they did know, and they had heard, that Jews don't fool with Canaanites or any other kind of Gentile. You see, in the disciples' eyes and in their understanding, Jesus is their Lord and their Master. He's here for Israel. He's not here for those old lazy, no-good Canaanites. But then the woman bows before Jesus and she says, "Lord, help me." And Jesus doubles down to make his point about who the disciples and everybody else thinks that this Canaanite woman is. He says, "It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." Now, I've tried to find some clarification on this, some sort of explanation in a commentary that explains how Jesus isn't calling this woman and all the other Canaanite dogs. Something to indicate that he's not generalizing an entire race of people as being less valuable, less important, less human than the Israelites. And the closest thing I could find is that since the Israelites were always calling the Canaanites and the Samaritans and everybody else really all kinds of dogs and swines and all sorts of other names, that Jesus was just using this analogy of feeding the humans before the animals so that his audience would understand that his ministry would be for the Jews and that later on the Apostle Paul's ministry would be for the Gentiles. Now, of course, he didn't say any of that. I don't know if I was there, if I would have understood that from what he did say. I know if I was that woman, I wouldn't have thought that's what he meant. Because he's still calling her and her people animals. But she hits right back at him. She says, "Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the tables of their masters." It's as if she's saying, if I'm a dog and you Jews are the masters, well then I guess you're just the table scraps, Jesus. You're the one that they made come down here to earth to fool with all of us. And Jesus says, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And he heals her daughter at that time. Now, knowing, as he knows all things, that salvation is for the Canaanites and the other Gentiles, that salvation is for everyone, that God's house is a house of prayer for everyone, and knowing, as he knows all things, that he's going to heal her daughter, why does Jesus have this strange and sort of racist conversation with this woman? Well, I believe he does it to show us that he knows what his disciples think about Canaanites. He knows what Jews think about Gentiles. He knows what we, some of us anyway, what we think about foreigners, minorities, those different from us. Jesus knows that human beings many times divide themselves up by race, by religion, by politics, gender and sexuality, economic status. Jesus knows that Sunday morning is the most segregated day of the week. And by having this conversation with this woman in front of and with his disciples and recording it for us to read now, Jesus is saying, I know what you humans think about each other. I know what you think that some people aren't even worth acknowledging. I know that you think that some people don't belong. I know that you think that some people are like animals. I know that you think these people don't deserve to know my name, and you're wrong. God's house is a house of prayer for all people. God's salvation is for all people. Jesus died for all people. And everyone, no matter who they are, where they're from, what color their skin is welcome in God's kingdom. Jesus is saying, I will bring them to my holy mountain, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. You see, Jesus could have healed the woman's daughter as soon as she walked up to him. But he had this conversation with her in this way to show us that we all can get caught up in nationalism, racism, and discrimination if we're not careful. That just as it would have been wrong for him to refuse her under these pretenses, it is wrong for us to discriminate in the ways that we do. God's house is a house of prayer for all people. And if we are to be God's people, our houses have to be for all people as well. You see, Jesus could have said, well, of course, I'm here for all people. Of course I am. I'll heal this woman. All lives matter. But by naming and saying the things that the disciples were thinking, by illustrating how callous our attitudes on race can be, and by showing that yes, all lives matter, but right now, today, this particular woman, this Canaanite woman, this foreign woman, this subhuman dog, as you call her, woman, this woman matters. Her life matters. Her child's life matters. He teaches us that these differences and divisions are not how God views us. To him we are all his children. We are all his people. We are all recipients of his love and his salvation. We are all children of God, made in his image. We must live in peace and harmony with one another. For as Isaiah the prophet said in our first reading, God's house is a house of prayer for all people. May we all work diligently to make this a reality.